Hello, everybody, and welcome to the EENR Center's Transition in Energy Law and Governance series. I am Victor Flatt, one of the faculty co-directors of the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Center. Our center focuses on the intersection of environment, climate, and energy, that we need to look at all three of those to help manage the transition to a just environment. I'm now going to turn the program over to our postgraduate fellow, Professor Aubin Nzaou, and he will tell you more about the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Flatt. Thank you, Victor. Thank you for joining our virtual lecture with our guest speaker, Professor Rebecca Bratspie from the City University of New York School of Law. It's a great pleasure to have you all today in this program. My name is Aubin Nzaou, and I'm a researcher at the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Center at the University of Houston Law Center. And I would like to say a few words about our monthly lecture series on energy transition and climate governance. Our program is funded by the European Commission through the H2020 program and Marie Curie Actions. And our research covers a variety of topics in energy law and climate policy. Each month, we convene speakers to address topics related to the challenges of our time. As part of this series, on June 17th, Professor Lisa Benjamin from Lewis and Clark Law School will speak on business and climate change. For more information, please visit our website, www.law.uh.edu/EENR-Center/. I'll now turn it over to our own Professor Tracy Hester, co-director of the Center for Carbon Management in Energy, CCME, at the University of Houston, and our chair this morning.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure to participate in this monthly seminar. There's always a lot of interesting speakers and topics to tackle. And I have a short duty for you this morning because the main topic of the day is an exciting and interesting one, and I'm looking forward to hearing about it. I'm introducing our guest speaker. And as always, the biography does little justice to the depth of her background and career. Rebecca Bratspie is a professor at CUNY School of Law, and she is the director of the Center for Urban Environmental Reform. And she is a very well-known, respected member of the environmental law community. I suspect most folks on the call already know Rebecca and know about her high-level work on environmental justice. Her most recent book is actually on environmental justice, law, policy, and regulation. She's an appointed member of New York City's Environmental Justice Advisory Panel and of EPA's Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee. And probably most fun of all, and actually probably in the long run as impactful as any scholarly publications, she's pulled together environmental justice comic books, Maya's Lot and Venus Plant, which help build environmental literacy for an upcoming generation of environmental leaders. And we underestimate the impact that kind of form of communication has of shaping opinions. The other thing that her bio misses is that she is just a bottomless well of energy herself and lots of fun to hear. So with that, I'll turn the microphone over to Rebecca. Thanks, Rebecca, welcome.
Thank you very much, Tracy, Aubin, and Victor. It's a delight to be here with you today, and I'm just gonna share my screen and we'll hope that this works. Okay, so thank you for mentioning the environmental justice comic books. I try to show them wherever I go. If you're looking at this, as I'm going to sort of do my introduction, I made a hyperlink to Venus Plant. This is the second of the environmental justice comic books. We're currently working on the third, but this one is a fictionalized version of the true story of the community organizing behind the groups that got the Paletti power plant shut here in New York City. And the Paletti power plant had been the single biggest polluter in New York City, emitting more PM than all of the other stationary sources in New York City combined. It was one of the 10 most dirty power plants in the country. And it's really a very interesting story. So I encourage you to check that out. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. What I'm here to talk about today is the inevitable intersection of social justice, racial justice, and energy justice. And as energy lawyers, or as environmental lawyers, or as international lawyers or human rights lawyers, or whatever it is that we do, it's essential that we appreciate how much of the burden associated with energy extraction and production has been borne by communities of color, and how little of the benefit in terms of access to energy those communities have accrued from all of that burden that they've borne. So what I'm going to do is talk in detail about Rikers Island, which is currently New York City's main jail. The details may seem to you like they have nothing to do with energy or the environment, but work with me, and I hope at the end you'll see the connections, and more importantly, we'll start asking similar set of questions about energy generation wherever it is that you happen to be. So just some quick background about Rikers Island. Rikers Island is part of the traditional territory of the Munsee Lenape, the Wappinger, and the Mattenkock tribes. And by the way, I'm speaking to you today from Lenape land. And around 1654, Dutch Governor Stuyvesant granted this island to the Van Ryken family. The Van Ryken family, who ultimately anglicized their name to Rikers, were slaveholders who exploited enslaved labor to build their fortune. They then parlayed that fortune into social and political prominence in New York. And they socialized with the governor and led the Marquis de Lafayette on his triumphant return to New York in the 1800s, and basically were part of the wealthy elite of New York. So I want to direct your attention first to the man in the upper left. His name is Richard Riker. He was New York City's recorder, which is the equivalent of a municipal judge. And his dual reputation sums up New York City's experience with Rikers Island. During the decades before the Civil War, Recorder Riker was infamous for abusing the Fugitive Slave Act and selling Black New Yorkers into slavery. Rikers abused his position as a city recorder to declare African Americans to be runaway slaves without allowing them the opportunity to demonstrate that they were actually free citizens and not subject to the Fugitive Slave Act. The differing perspectives of white and Black New Yorkers concerning Rikers himself presaged the different experiences white and Black New York had more than a century later with over-policing, mass incarceration, and brutality at Rikers prison complex. Black New Yorkers bore the brunt while white New Yorkers saw nothing amiss. To white New York, Recorder Riker was an admirable citizen and public servant. To Black New York, he was a dangerous, lawless menace. And history repeats itself. The era of stop and frisk and mass incarceration saw Black and brown New Yorkers arrested and imprisoned at disproportionately high rates, while the white portions of the city largely noticed nothing amiss. The powerful Black Lives Matter protests that emerged in the wake of the Minneapolis police killing of George Floyd forced this issue of structural racism into public discourse across the country. Just an interesting side note to my research, in the lower left, you see a cartoon of three men. The one in the center is, excuse me, is abolitionist David Ruggles of the New York Committee of Vigilance. He was a leader in the Underground Railroad and reportedly personally led 600 enslaved people north to freedom, including Frederick Douglass. And this cartoon is the first recorded American cartoon to feature a recognizable Black person as opposed to a generic caricature. And it comes out of confronting Recorder Rikers over his record. So just a historical side note, but I like to point it out whenever I can. So this is, Rikers Island was the property of the Rikers family for many, many years. And in 1884, New York City bought Rikers Island. In 1932, Rikers became home to the main jail of New York City. Most of the current expanse of the island, you can see the original island and now its current expanse. Most of it was built from Manhattan trash, particularly coal trash, using forced prison labor to, quote, reclaim the island's shoals. And until 1939 World's Fair brought an end to the dumping, the island was noteworthy because it was on fire at night with all the coal refuse it held and the smoke emanating up from it. From the very beginning of using Rikers Island as a jail, it was a disaster. It was a penal colony to send Black and brown New Yorkers to. You can see there's one connection to the mainland, one narrow causeway, that's it. By every conceivable metric, Rikers Island is a toxic place. In addition to the brutality that occurred there, it continues to off-gas methane to this day. It's also in the flight path for LaGuardia Airport, and it has an immense noise burden. So this is what Rikers Island looks like today from the air. And I'm just going to share just a few of the headlines about Rikers Island over the years. But before that, I do want to point out that most of the detainees held on Rikers Island over the years come from 5 neighborhoods in New York: South Bronx, Brownsville, East New York, Harlem, and Bed-Stuy. And we're going to come back to those neighborhoods over and over again. 80% of the people at Rikers Island are pretrial detainees. They are people who've been convicted of nothing, and they are held because they can't make bail. Overwhelmingly, they're Black and brown, coming from over-policed neighborhoods where stop and frisk was most egregious. In Floyd versus the City of New York, a federal judge found that more than 80% of those suffering Terry stops at the hands of New York Police Department were Black and Latino, and that's this practice of stop and frisk was unconstitutionally biased, and that the police had a policy of targeting Black and Hispanic young men. So Rikers violence out of control. America's 10 worst prisons, Lord of the Flies for youths, a stain on human decency. And those were headlines about the guards' brutality. And then we get to the tragic case of Khalif Browder, who was held at Rikers Island between 2010 and 2013 for the crime of allegedly stealing a backpack. He spent 3 years awaiting his speedy trial, most of which he was held in suicide. He suffered abuse at the hand of guards and at the hands of other prisoners, much of which was video recorded and is available, unfortunately, for the rest of us to see. He was ultimately released without having had a trial in 2014, but was so traumatized by his experience that he wound up committing suicide in 2015. And his experience prompted the Obama administration to rethink solitary confinement. And he has been a rallying cry for the Close Rikers movement. So his death in 2015 galvanized opponents to mass incarceration, and under the leadership of Just USA, headed by formerly incarcerated individuals, the case for shutting Rikers gained power. And in 2016, I think it was, City Council Speaker Melissa Mark Viveritos appointed a panel to investigate the situation at Rikers Island and appointed former New York Chief Justice Jonathan Littman to head the independent commission. It's generally referred to as the Littman Commission. And the thing is that these activists that I was describing to you, they had a really audacious goal. Their goal was not, let's make Rikers more humane, or let's moderate the brutality on Rikers. That had been the goal for a long time, and it had failed. They had a much more audacious goal, which was shut Rikers entirely. And I think one of the lessons to learn from this experience is that you should have audacious goals. You might not get them, but for sure, if you do not have big visionary demands, for sure you will not get big visionary change. Anyway, the Littman Commission in 2017 issued its report, A More Just New York City. And in this, the Littman Commission, again, headed by the former Chief Judge of New York State, unequivocally called for Rikers Island Correctional Facility to be shut, calling it, quote, a stain on the city. And in fall of 2019, City Council enacted Local Law 192, which mandated that Rikers will be shut. Remember, the overwhelming majority of people held at Rikers are pretrial detainees. At the same time this was happening, New York State dramatically changed its bail laws, reducing the amount of bail and the offenses for which bail could be required. Turns out that if you don't demand bail from poor people, you don't need so many jails. From a peak of around 20,000 in the 1990s, Rikers Island now holds fewer than 7,000, and that number is decreasing almost daily. So that leaves the question, what happens to the island after the jail shuts in 2026? That's where Renewable Rikers comes in. As I use the term, restorative justice climate justice draws from philosopher Nancy Fraser's insights that social justice requires both redistribution and recognition. In the environmental context, restorative justice tends to focus on community harms and community restoration. Viewed in this light, the Renewable Rikers plan that I'm going to describe to you offers a path for not only remediating and mitigating past environmental harm, but for providing public benefits that flow to injured communities as a form of reparations. So as I mentioned, in 2017, the Littman Commission issued the report, A More Just New York. And on page 110 of this 110-page report, there was one paragraph that suggested that after the Rikers penal colony shut, maybe the island could be used for some kind of sustainable something. And it was this paragraph that Renewable Rikers advocates took as an opening and ran with it. So by connecting decarceration with environmental justice, we advocated using the closing of Rikers Island to right some old environmental wrongs. Wrongs, moreover, that led to an outside pollution burden on the very same communities most impacted by incarceration at Rikers Island, specifically energy production in New York City. So if we look at where energy is consumed in New York City, you can see, and by the way, red means more power consumption. You can see that most of the consumption is in Manhattan. Manhattan is wealthier and whiter than Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx, which are the other parts shown here, even though there are far more people in Queens and Brooklyn than in Manhattan, roughly 3 times as many. Yet, as you can see, most of the energy is consumed in Manhattan. Oh, and by the way, this is Rikers Island. But where does the power come from? Because of transmission bottlenecks in the wealthy suburbs, New York law requires that 82% of New York City's power be locally generated within the city itself. And if you look at this map, this is a map of where the peaker power plants are located in the city. Purple is environmental justice communities. Now, notice just how few of the plants are located where most of the power is consumed. New York's 16 peaker natural gas fired power plants are disproportionately located in communities of color in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens. In fact, these plants are clustered in the same neighborhoods that are overburdened by incarceration at Rikers. And in those neighborhoods, the power plants are located near playgrounds and parks in communities of color. This particular picture is the Ravenswood plant, which is about a block away from Queensbridge Housing Project. It is directly adjacent to the Queensbridge Park, and you can see the playground here. The Queensbridge Public Housing Project is the single biggest project in the entire country. It has well over 3,000 apartments. So Renewable Rikers focuses on one particular subset of power generation and one small slice of energy and justice in New York City. And that is the location of the 10 peaker plants that were cited in 2000. Not in the distant past, but in the year 2000, relatively recently. In 2000, energy generation, New York State was undergoing energy deregulation. California, which was ahead of New York in the deregulation process, was suffering rolling blackouts. And even though it was pretty clear at the time that those blackouts were due to the manipulation of supply by Enron, among others, the blackouts were used in New York as an excuse to cite 10 peak power plants temporarily, they were supposed to be for 3 years, to see us through what was called a looming energy catastrophe. And this urgency for the temporarily citing these facilities in the face of an energy catastrophe meant that there was no time for, luxuries like environmental assessment. At the time, internal company documents showed that all of these plants were destined for environmental justice communities, and also showed that the projected energy needs were vastly overstated to justify these facilities. Nevertheless, the mantra, every day brings us one day closer to California, was used to rush these plants through with no environmental assessment. Anyone born the year these temporary plants were cited is now old enough to drink, and the plants are still there. They're still spewing pollution into overburdened communities. And just to take a step back, for those of you unfamiliar with peaker plants, this graph sort of gives you a basic description. right? New York's Public Utility Commission defines a peaker plant as one that operates less than 10% of the time. They phase on and off to meet peak demand, particularly in the summer to meet air conditioning needs. The startup and shutdown cycles are the most polluting times, and these plants cycle off and on regularly, spewing particulates, NOx, and SOx into the air. Again, notice where the peaker plants are clustered, this time plotted against heat vulnerability. And again, I want to point out Rikers Island to you here. New York City is an urban heat island, meaning it has higher ambient temperatures than the surrounding, less urbanized region. And these high ambient temperatures translate into unsafe indoor temperatures that jeopardize the health of vulnerable groups in the most vulnerable communities. By 2050, New York City can expect to see double the number of 90-degree days, and in New York, that's really hot. And the number of heat waves is expected to triple or quadruple. These climate developments will also increase the heat island effect, and heat-related mortality is expected to rise significantly. And New Yorkers of color are far more likely to suffer the adverse health impacts from extreme heat, particularly in those very same communities most impacted by incarceration as Rikers and home to the peaker plants. This racial disparity is in part due to unequal access to air conditioning, particularly for residents of New York City's Public Housing Authority NYCHA buildings, which serve 1 out of every 15 New Yorkers. While 90% of New York City's general population is air conditioning, fewer than half of NYCHA residents do. And public housing residents overall are vastly less likely to have air conditioning. So they suffer the burdens of air pollution from the power generated to meet air conditioning demands from the peaker plants, but do not benefit from the air conditioning that the energy powers. These are also the communities with the highest rate of asthma hospitalizations and death, and most recently, the highest rates of COVID mortality. The peaker plants, right? This is a picture of the LIC peaker plants, one of the plants cited as part of the Power Now project in 2020. And they are on the other side of that park I showed you earlier, adjacent to the Ravenswood facility and directly across the street from the Queensbridge houses, as I said, the largest housing project in the United States. These peaker plants are extremely polluting. The oldest operating peaker plant in New York City dates back to 1953. The efficiency of many of these plants is as low as 25%. And when running, the peaker plants account for roughly 1/3 of the NOx and a huge chunk of the PM 2.5 in New York City's air. And one of the things we've learned over the past year is that pollution levels, particularly PM 2.5, are intimately associated with COVID infection rates, as well as the underlying cardiopulmonary preconditions that make people more vulnerable to COVID. So here's another map, this one about childhood asthma. Again, the neighborhoods most impacted by mass incarceration at Rikers, the neighbors overburdened with peaker plants, and the neighborhoods with the highest asthma rates closely aligned. In the dark blue on this map, the asthma rates can be double the average New York City rate, and they are an order of magnitude greater than in the least impacted communities. But the problem is that peaker plants are extremely lucrative for their owners. There are massive public subsidies to keep them on standby, and this is some of the most expensive power generated in the country. The kilowatt hours they generate are definitely the most expensive in New York, and that creates pressure to keep them open from the owners and their lobbying groups. One more thing I want to add before I tell you more about Renewable Rikers, and that is that New York is a severe ozone non-attainment zone. And ozone pollution, again, tracks those same patterns. The same neighborhoods where the peaker plants are, where the heat risk is, where the kids with asthma live, where the COVID rates are, those are the neighborhoods that were, again, most burdened by Rikers Island. That's where Renewable Rikers comes in. Renewable Rikers is a plan to dedicate a portion of the island to large-scale solar energy generation and battery storage once the jail shuts, in order to remove gas-fired peaker plants located in environmental justice communities. Now, according to a preliminary analysis by Sustainable CUNY, 35 acres of PV panels installed on Rikers Island could generate about 17.2 gigawatt hours annually. A mere 12 acres, or 4% of the island, could potentially hold over 15 200 megawatts worth of storage, which is, for perspective, about half the goal set for the entire state by the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that I'll tell you about in a minute. The reason that this is possible is that most of the peaker plants run for only a few hours at a time, making it entirely feasible to replace their contribution to the power base with this renewable energy at Rikers. And at the same time, removing noxious environmental uses from environmental justice communities would improve air quality in these overburdened communities, and the land currently occupied by these peaker plants could then be repurposed for community benefits such as green space or affordable housing. The communities that play unwilling host to these facilities, again, are those most impacted by incarceration at Rikers Island. By embracing the possibility of transformation, Renewable Rikers offers a kind of environmental restorative justice for these communities. And particularly so because the goal is to have not only the neighborhoods most benefited by the transition to renewable energy, but also trying to make sure that the green jobs of solar energy technician and wind turbine technicians, which are the two fastest growing job categories in the United States, albeit from a small base, go to those formerly incarcerated at Rikers. So there's an attempt to tie job training to this process as well. So recent changes in New York and New York City law, so state law and city law, support this transformation, as does the Biden administration's commitment to transitioning from fossil fuels. And I'm just going to tell you really quickly about two main developments in New York, or maybe three, and then wrap up and leave time for questions. So first, in 2019, the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, the state regulatory agency, adopted new NOx emission rules that are going to force many of the city's peaker plants to shut by 2024. The peaker plants have the option under these new regulations to renovate to meet the new NOx rules while still burning fossil fuels, but most of them are not either not opting for that or not able to do that. So here's give you a sense of what the change is going to mean. It's going to be a 99% reduction in NOx emissions, and that's obviously going to make a big difference in air pollution emissions. And this is a result, right? This state regulation is a result of the broader advocacy strategy around Renewable Rikers, which has been connecting the dots between the siting of peaker plants, the pollution from those plants, and wider issues of social justice and equity in the city and across the state. And one of the really exciting developments that has just happened is that NYPA, the New York Power Authority, which is the owner of all of the Power Now facilities, the ones cited in 2000, has recently entered into an MOU with a group of New York City environmental justice groups that are acting in coalition in order to evaluate the potential to replace those 10 Power Now plants with renewable and battery storage systems consistent with the state reliability requirements. So there's real change happening, and it's very exciting. Another big initiative on the state is the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was passed in 2019. So this requires that 70% of the state's electricity come from renewable energy by 2030 and 100% by 2040. But there's more. Section 7 of the CLCPA requires that state regulators must consider in granting any permits, licenses, administrative approvals, contracts, et cetera, whether or not the facilities are consistent with the greenhouse gas emission limits and whether or not they disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. And many of the peaker plants in New York City, even the ones that would survive the DEC regulations, must renew their Title V air permits within the next year or so, and all of them will be subject to this dual analysis of whether they are consistent with the state targets and whether or not they disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. So this is very exciting, and it is, again, intimately tied with the Renewable Rikers initiative. So this slide is just some specifics from the CLCPA, because I just wanted to emphasize that one of the things the CLCPA does is that it prioritizes environmental and energy justice. And New York, in adopting the CLCPA, established interlocking definitions for environmental justice communities and disadvantaged communities that are going to get the lion's share of the benefit of investment for clean energy. Under Local Law 60, New York City has a similar obligation to identify the location and boundaries of environmental justice communities within the city. And of course, going back to the communities most impacted by Rikers Island, the South Bronx, Brownsville, East New York, Harlem, and Bed-Stuy, they rank high on any list of environmental injustice in New York City or New York State. So Renewable Rikers is about bringing restorative environmental justice to these communities. So let me tell you a little bit about Renewable Rikers itself in the couple of minutes I have left. So it's still a work in progress. And I had the honor to testify at this particular hearing in February 2020 in favor of the trio of bills that collectively make up the Renewable Rikers plan. The idea behind these three bills is to tie the pending shutdown of the correctional facility to restorative environmental justice, and to really transform the city in the process. So in this, just so you know, in this photo, the man on the right is City Council Speaker Corey Johnson, and he opened this hearing with a full-throated endorsement of the process. The man on the left, though, is more important to the story. He's Kostas Konstantinidis. He's the lead architect of the Renewable Rikers proposal in City Council. He's also the architect of Local Law 97, which mandates dramatic improvements in building efficiency for existing buildings in New York City, a change that by itself, when it's fully implemented in 2030, will reduce US carbon emissions by 1.5% overall. And it's a true statement that if we manage to meet or exceed our Paris commitment, it will of course be due to the Biden administration's full-throated push, but also in no small part due to the actions of this council member Konstantinidis. Over the years, I've had the honor to work closely with him on this project and to enact the environmental justice bills that New York City adopted in 2017. Now, unfortunately, you notice the date here, February 2020. Soon after this hearing, COVID forced City Council to close City Hall and suspend hearings, temporarily stalling the initiative. And in fact, Costa came down with a very bad case of COVID, one that ultimately forced him to retire from his council seat. However, just this year in February 2021, just before Costa stepped down, all three bills were enacted by City Council and signed by the mayor. So they are now law in New York. Introduction 1592 transfers jurisdiction of Rikers Island from the Department of Corrections. Introduction 1593 directs the Mayor's Office of Sustainability to conduct a feasibility study on the potential of generating and storing renewable energy. And these bills offer the city a pathway to building a hub for sustainability and resilience on Rikers Island that can serve as a model for the rest of the country and cities around the world. It also importantly creates a 15-member Rikers Island Advisory Committee, which includes environmental justice representatives and members of the public who've been impacted directly by incarceration on the island. So we're trying to make sure that environmental justice and restorative actions are locked in to the process itself. Now, this isn't just an environmental justice essential, it's also a climate necessity. What you see on this map is the projected 100-year floodplain. Everything in blue is expected to flood, and everything in gray is what will flood using more dire predictions about sea level rise and storm surge. And as I pointed out with the arrows, this is where New York City generates 60% of its energy. So this is a necessity by every measure you could use to measure it. Rikers Island, on the other hand, is largely above the 100-year floodplain, and most of it is above the 500-year floodplain as well. So it's really an ideal place to site energy generation. And I tell you this, all of this, as an academic who has written extensively about this project, and also as an advocate who's worked hard to build the political coalition to make this possible. But for me, this is also extremely personal. So I'm just going to end with this slide. This is the view from my window. So this story is a story about my life as well. And with that, I am, if you want to read more about it, this is the most recent article that I've published on the topic. And I'm glad to take any questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Rebecca. That was a fabulous presentation. I will offer a small personal comment before we start moving to questions. And then I also, if you had any instructions on how folks can relay questions, just I'll step aside in a second for you to do that. But I wanted to say one of the major challenges I hear from folks wrestling with environmental justice is how to visualize ways to translate environmental justice concepts into actual concrete proposals that both benefit the environment and impact the communities. And this is a spectacular test case. It really shows how you can achieve both at the same time. So I'm very curious and excited to see how it will continue ahead. It sounds like the finish line's in view, but not quite there. So hopefully, you know, the MOU will play out and we'll get some good input on it. So before I offer a few questions, Amanda, do you have anything you'd like to offer in terms of our audience?
I'm going to display the CLE slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
And for those of you seeking CLE credit, this is the number and the Q code that you'll use to be able to obtain that credit. And while that's up, Rebecca, I guess one question I'll go ahead and start with is there's obviously been some exciting developments in this just the past few weeks on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, as well as other additional proposals with environmental justice initiatives as part of infrastructure at the federal level. I was wondering if that is going to affect or open up additional opportunities for the Renewable Rikers project and perhaps extrapolating it up to the next level.
I mean, that's the hope. One of the laws that not really laws, ordinances that City Council enacted in February is not only that the land has to be turned over from the Department of Corrections in 2026 when the correctional facility closes, but it has to be handed over in stages as they shut portions of the Rikers Correctional Facility. That has to be turned over. So we're expecting the first turnover to be in the next year. So while the corrections won't be off the island entirely for another 5 years, this is going to be an unfolding situation, and that means there's a possibility to start doing things immediately. We're still in the investigation phase to figure out how to maximize the potential for the island. And to be clear, I mean, one thing that I didn't say that I should say is that our governor would very much like Rikers to be home to a new runway for LaGuardia Airport. So there is a contest going on over the fate of the space and the contest, I should say, between New York City's current mayor and our current governor are sort of legendary about everything. And so this is in that as well, though I think that, first of all, the governor has a lot less clout than he used to, given his own personal drama. But I hope that this has gained enough momentum that it's not stoppable. And the Biden administration's support is just a dream come true in terms of making these things happen and getting early investment for feasibility studies and to begin the process of this conversion.
Excellent. We've even heard about the governor's travails down here in Texas. So yes, I was curious. That was my other question for you, which is what are the competing land use demands for Rikers? I mean, it is a spectacular amount of real estate next to one of the most densely populated spots in the United States. I imagine there's a lot of competing pressures to try and grab that island for other uses.
Yes and no. The island off-gases methane, and it's in the flight path of LaGuardia Airport. Much of the island you can't build over 15 stories, which for New York is short. And it's in the 65 DNL contour, which is the point at which the FAA will retrofit buildings for noise or buy people out. So it's, on the one hand, it's a huge chunk of real estate. On the other hand, it's a really undesirable chunk of real estate. And it is connected to the mainland by one causeway, and that's it.
Yeah, but ironically, the methane may have some potential co-benefits if you can capture and use it, I would imagine. But that's probably part of the wastewater treatment plant or other possibilities. Yeah. I also said, we got a question even before your presentation began, which I thought was rather interesting. There was one of our members of the audience who was curious whether or not the environmental justice component of Renewable Rikers might include direct compensation or restitution to burdened communities, in addition to removing the peaker plants. Is that something on the table at this point?
Well, the CLCPA directs that 35 at a minimum and ideally 40% of all clean energy investments will be directed to historically overburdened communities. And in New York City, that means the communities most impacted by incarceration on Rikers. So I think there are parallel tracks that are going to be moving at the same time. The Renewable Rikers plan itself doesn't contemplate direct cash investments in those communities. It contemplates removing polluting infrastructure from those communities and then having the land be something much more community oriented. And I have to say, for me personally, one of the coolest aspects of this campaign has been the way that prison reform advocates and formerly incarcerated people have really embraced environmental justice and have really seen the connection between the forces that sort of promoted mass incarceration and the forces that promote environmental injustice. And that to me is really exciting, because one of the problems we often have in environmental advocacy is trying to break out of the silo of people who already care about the environment and to connect environmental injustices to broader social injustice and to help people see that it's all part of the same thing. And that has been really exciting to see.
It's one of the striking things about the proposal. Yeah. I guess in part, I'm kind of curious, is this a perfect storm? I mean, to a certain extent, having the correctional facility shut down in its location with environmental justice co-benefits like this, or is there an opportunity to extend this concept to other either types of power facilities or other locations? For example, offhand, one of the dirtiest sources of intermittent power, in addition to peakers, is backup generators. Typically run.
I'm sorry, you cut out. I didn't hear that.
Backup generators.
Yeah.
Powered by diesel fuel, typically kick in when power cuts out, and you just see the brown haze spread whenever they do. Is there any possibility of extending this concept of offsetting with environmental justice benefits other types of intermittent power?
Yeah, I think there is. I'm going to give you a different example from New York City, just because that's where I'm rooted. And to say that this is a perfect storm, I think phrases it in a way that removes the agency. The reason this is a perfect storm is that there was tremendous advocacy on all fronts for years. And that culminated in the pressure on city council that led the then city council chair, Melissa Mark Viveritos, to create the Lippman Commission. And then it was the environmental justice advocates who took that one paragraph in the Lippman report and developed it into a vision for what restorative environmental justice would look like. So yes, I think it's possible. Yes, I think it's in fact probable wherever you have people willing to do the advocacy work and strategic about that advocacy work. Another area in New York City where that is, I think we're seeing that manifest, is in the way that waste transfer stations are being regulated to minimize their impacts on communities, these same communities in New York City. New York City passed a waste equity bill that reduced the amount of the city's trash that could flow into these overburdened communities and required as part of waste equity, that each borough manage its own trash, which meant that Manhattan, which historically had no waste transfer stations, just like it has basically no peaker plants, had to start taking responsibility for its own waste. And surprise, surprise, as a result of that, waste generation has plummeted by like 23% in the affected communities. And the next iteration of that is New York City is in the process right now of creating commercial waste hauling zones, which will be structured to reduce truck trips by, can't remember the percentage, but it's millions of truck miles per year reductions, with the concomitant benefits in terms of pollution reduction and noise reduction and danger reduction in these same communities. Now, I could give you a whole other talk on it about everything that's wrong with New York City, but
Sure.
These are, I think, exciting developments.
No, absolutely. And be careful. Whenever you say you can give a whole other talk, we typically pounce quickly in that situation. I have a whole bunch of more questions, but I also want to make sure I'm not hogging all the bandwidth. Victor, did you have any questions you wanted to ask? I saw you lean forward and getting ready to unmic.
No. I'm looking at the Q&A. There's so many interesting questions. I want Rebecca to get as many as she can.
Oh, actually, I'm not seeing them on mine. Could you relay a couple of them?
Okay, that's strange. So
let me see.
Hold on, maybe just an artifact of the screen setup. Hold on.
Okay, so I see the questions now.
Okay.
Okay, I've got them now.
Okay.
Sorry,
Yeah.
they were covered by another window.
So Gina asks, what happens, hi Gina, what happens if the state or the city fail to meet the mandates? And that is the question that we are dealing with right now. There's a law right now that's being debated by the New York State Senate and Assembly that gives teeth to those deadlines. Because right now there's not a lot in the way of penalties, but I hope this law is going to pass and it will give significant penalties for failing to meet those mandates. And I think New York's going to meet them. I really do. I think that, first of all, the momentum is in place, but there are enough projects coming online and they're getting less and less expensive. And with the big federal push, I think we're going to meet these deadlines. And in fact, I think we're going to exceed them. Dinah asks whether or not the Rikers inmates have been consulted. And yes, one of the beauties of the Renewable Rikers project is that it is led by formerly incarcerated people. Experts like me are on the sidelines. The leaders of this movement is Just USA, which is an organization of formerly incarcerated people, and they are the primary advocates for this plan.
Rebecca, before you move on, I think Victor said he wanted to answer one of the questions.
Go for it.
No. Go to the question
I thought
line.
it said typing and it said you wanted to answer a question live. So, okay.
No. I want Rebecca to get to as many of these as she can.
Excellent. I'm sorry, Becca. Go ahead.
So then an anonymous attendee asked, do you think that transforming a symbol of inhumanity into an environmentally friendly project will help promote both public value and social justice by restoring dignity to these communities and reconciling the rest of the people and overburdened communities? That is our hope. Whatever happens on Rikers Island, there will be a monument there to the brutality that occurred, because we can't forget. And part of the reason that in every talk that I give about this, I tie it back to Recorder Rikers and the way that the Riker family enslaved people, is that this is a long story. And this is this is one piece of a broader story about racial supremacy in the United States and the way that law has been deployed to oppress Black people in particular, but people of color, and to benefit white Americans. And I think that Renewable Rikers is both a recognition of that and a public statement that things will change and that we as a community are capable of change, and that every community and every individual has dignity and is worthy of respect.
That was a wonderful answer, Rebecca. don't want to scramble a queue for you, but I was interested in particular on the last question that's showing on my screen, which says, is there a connection between renewable Rikers and urban policy? And the role of urban planning and policy in recomposing social mix. In part, I was also hoping I could weave in a little bit of a question that was lingering on my list as well, which is, to what extent do the local communities have the ability to control the use of land freed up by the closure of peaker plants? I mean, I'm assuming that since NIPA is involved, it gives them some opportunities they wouldn't have if it was a private power generator.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is TBD. It's to be determined based on how this plays out. How exactly these facilities are shut and what happens to the land after they're shut, I think will vary. Right, the DEC regulations will force the shuttering of a lot of these peaker plants because they can't meet the NOx standard and won't. What happens to the land after that, whether that land is converted to renewable energy generation, whether that land is turned over to other uses, I think is an open question. For the NIPA land, for the power plants that are directly tied to Renewable Rikers, which is the year 2000 Power Now plan, those are publicly owned, and so there's a lot more possibility for creative, I think, advocacy and flexibility. And NIPA has already, as I said, entered into an MOU with a group of environmental justice advocates that have, they formed themselves into a fantastic coalition called the Peak Coalition. And they wrote a really influential report in maybe early 2020 or late 2019, I forget which, and have done just a great job of advocacy. So the answer there is, I think it's going to depend. I think it will depend on the effectiveness of the advocacy. It will also depend on what kind of funds are available. New York City obviously was extremely hard hit by COVID and is in a fiscal crisis right now. The federal support is helping. We don't know what's going to happen. So I would encourage all of you, once you're vaccinated, come to New York City, come visit us. We need help. But not until you're vaccinated.
And that's a whole nother conversation as well.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think we only had one other question in the queue, and we also need to save a few minutes at the end to do housekeeping for the series. So anonymous attendee also asked whether or not there's any possibility for civil liability compensation against the state, NIPA, or the city for overburdened communities as part of this discussion.
I don't think so. To the extent that the peaker plants are violating their permits, which is always a question, particularly at the startup and shutdown, right? There's the possibility that they could be held accountable for that, but the penalties goes to the state treasury. They don't go to the communities involved. And other than violating their permits, there's nothing illegal about where these facilities were sited. There's nothing illegal about them running. It's an injustice, and law and justice are not necessarily congruent, but I don't think that there's any possibility of civil liability there. I mean, what there is the possibility of is different practices going forward.
Certainly having public institutions as the actors makes the civil liability question a lot more complex as well, if there ever was a possibility. Yeah. All right, well then we're getting close to the end of our hour. I just wanted to see if Aubin or Victor had any other questions they wanted to ask before we start wrapping things up. Victor seems happy. That seems happy.
Well, if Victor's happy, I'm happy.
Everyone's happy. All right, well then with that, Rebecca, thank you. That was a fabulous presentation on an extraordinarily timely topic. We really appreciate it. I would recommend to everybody to take a look at Rebecca's article appearing in the Loyola Law Review. I think its biggest challenge is that events seem to be moving so quickly that you're going to be updating your footnotes up to the last minute.
Yes. I also encourage everybody to check out the environmental justice comic books. They are available online from the Center for Urban Environmental Reform website. They are available for free download and use for any non-commercial use. The third book is in production right now, and it has the characters of the first two entering electoral politics on a climate justice platform. So it will be done maybe end of July, and it will also be freely available.
Oh,
and thank you so much for inviting me today and for listening to what I had to say and being nice about it. Much appreciated.
No, it is our honor and our pleasure. And I'm looking forward to having a cup of coffee and sharing a conversation about your comic book with you at our next meeting, hopefully in person.
Oh, I hope so.
Which won't be too far away. So with that, thank you as well to our audience for participating in today's session. We look forward, hopefully, to visiting with you at our session coming up next month. Also, I wanted to give everyone a reminder that we actually have a virtual conference coming up on May 25th. The second annual Global Energy Law and Policy Conference, which is on the energy transition in a COVID-altered world, will take place starting at 9 a.m. Central Time. And we're covering a pretty broad array of different topics, energy transitions in a COVID-disrupted Africa, for example, nuclear power in the energy transition, energy insecurity in the United States, a host of other key issues, including non-state actors, climate litigation, energy justice, which always piques my interest. It's sponsored by the UH Law Center, also by the EENR Center and the Center for US and Mexican Law. And look for an invitation to participate if you haven't gotten one already. Other than that, we hope everyone has a wonderful summer lined up ahead for you and that you have the opportunity to stay in touch and be productive and stay safe. With that, I'll turn the mic back to Aubin and Victor if you had any other final thoughts. I see them waving on mute, which means we are done. So thank you again, Rebecca. Hopefully we'll see each other again very soon.
Hope so. Take care.
Victor is frozen. Victor, can you hear me? He is frozen. Okay. Bye, Rebecca. Oh, okay, okay. Can you hear me, Victor?